On the agenda tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the biggest scandal of the music industry and asking, given the current day industry, how bad was it? Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. So this is where we introduce Milli Vanilli. This is an act that I didn't have any awareness of previously when I was looking at auto-tune, pitch correction and videos where the artists have been miming on stage and it might have gone wrong. And this band, I say band, the duo were mentioned to me and I've looked into it because we can look at this with an interesting angle now that technology has moved along where we can start to speculate if this is going to happen nowadays, what kind of form would it take? So just for a bit of background, there was a producer, still is a producer, called Frank Farian, and he wanted to be a singer himself and released a record, but unfortunately it didn't do very well. So he then hired somebody else to pretend to sing on stage who you've got to imagine he thought had a better image than himself, but then put his voice to this person acting on stage. And that act was known as Boney M. So that was Frank's voice, but Frank wasn't in the band at all. He just recorded in the studio. So he had the opposite situation where people liked his voice, but they didn't like his image. So he just put somebody else in front of the audience whose image he did like and put his voice to that person. So what Frank decided to do was put together a duo of guys that looked really good. He found Rob Pilatus and Fab Morvan, who were working as models at the time. And they have been interviewed saying that at the time, they were looking for any way to make money. They were really at their wits' end and looking for any job possible. So when this opportunity came along, they just signed the contracts because it was a way that they could make money. They probably didn't read the contracts, but Frank had what he wanted. Just to point out that Rob and Fab did sing themselves, but it wasn't up to the level that Frank wanted on the recordings. So that's why he got other singers in to sing in their place. Now, the problem came about when they started to become very successful, and I say it was a problem because you've got to put yourself in the position of these two guys, of Rob and Fab, that they know they're not singing on these songs that they're going out and performing. And that's literally all it was, just dancing and pretending to say the words. I mean, it must have been such a stressful situation for them because they're having to live out this lie. And the further it went, the worse it got because they won a Grammy for the best new artists on the scene. So they're now picking up awards for their vocals, their music, their songs, their performances, and they know that it isn't them singing. Now, when they did get credited with the vocals, this prompted Charles Shaw, who was a vocalist in the studio, to step forward and say, these guys aren't singing, that's my voice that has been credited to them. So they actually then worked out an agreement with Charles, the record label, to keep him quiet and stop him from coming out. But this was just the first in many hurdles that they'd have to try and overcome, and you can tell that it was never going to end well. Obviously, the more popular they became, the more interviews they had to do, and people then got an appreciation of their talking voices, and they noticed their accents, and the fact that they were a French-German R&B duo, there was a particular sound to their voices when they spoke, and people started to question how they had these perfect American accents when they sung. And it is something that can happen sometimes where people start to sound American when they sing, but generally that happens with English-speaking artists to begin with, but not people who speak a totally different language and then sing a song in English. So I think people started to become suspicious at that point. So jumping to 1990, they were doing very well and had sold a lot of albums, picked up a Grammy, and they had this performance at the MTV Awards. And unfortunately, the backing track got stuck and it started to skip. I'm just going to play a little bit of this so that we can hear exactly what happened.
Girl, you know, it's girl, you know, it's girl, you know, it's girl.
So you can see that the CD's stuck. The good thing about this is, I have to say, it's the perfect place for the CD to start skipping, because we've got the melody line and the phrase of "Girl, You Know It's," but it's skipping to pretty much a spot-on 4/4 time signature, which is what the song's going to be in anyway. So this is why, when you listen to this, and maybe why people didn't really notice, they thought it was just a DJ thing. Maybe they tend to do this kind of thing all the time and did back then, where they'd repeat a phrase over and over again just by pushing the record back and letting it play. Obviously it takes a bit of technique and skill to do that as a DJ, but it was a common technique. So I think people wouldn't really have noticed that. The other thing that I want to point out is the fact that, just looking at the performance, we've got the full band here. You know, we've got bass guitar, keys, a drummer, and everything is set up as would be now on TV shows and a lot of awards performances where it's not live. They set up everything to look live, and they even plug in all the instruments, get the microphones on stage and mic up amps, sometimes even have mics over the top of the drum kit, but they're all dummy mics, they're not used. This is something that I've pointed out recently on the Graham Norton show, which is a performance that we looked at, where they had all of this stuff set up, but it wasn't live, it was just a backing track being played. So I mean, this goes back, as we can see, to 1990, but it still happens today, even more so than it did back then. Another thing I want to mention is, because of the timing of this skip being so convenient, they might have been able to get away with it. And you can see that Fab on stage is starting to dance to the timing of this skip that we've got going. Unfortunately, Rob knows that it shouldn't be as it is and actually runs off the stage because he panics. And I mean, you've only got to try and put yourself in their position and Rob's position to know how he must have felt. The fact that the CD's skipping, he knows it's skipping. I don't think the audience knew that, but he's panicked, run off stage. But it might just be the difference in the personalities, that Fab is just rolling with it and continues to put on the show because he knows that they're still in time. Sometimes when a CD skips, it could have gone, go, go, and been stuck at that point, and then oh, this is wrong because it's not in time. So fast forwarding to when everything had been exposed, people knew that it wasn't them singing. Obviously, it was pretty much career ending for them, and sadly, Rob passed away at the age of 33. It obviously affected him a lot mentally, and he got into drugs, and sadly that was a reason and linked with his death. So it was a very stressful time for them personally, especially considering the fact that the record label, when they were asked about it, they didn't seem to regret anything, and they said, what's there to regret? We sold 7 million albums. And I mean, that's just a snapshot of the industry and why I stay out of the industry, because it's all about the money. It's not about the artists, and it's not about the art of music in any way, shape or form. It's just using a commodity, which is the artist, to make money for yourself, which is the record industry in a nutshell. So yeah, they didn't regret anything at all. And as for the people who have bought the albums, attended the shows, obviously they felt cheated. This is where it gets interesting from a law perspective, because there was a lawsuit in the USA brought against Arista, the record label, but also against Rob and Fab. And it really goes to show how little the public know about the music industry, that they didn't know that these guys were just as innocent as everybody else, that they signed a contract, they didn't know what they were signing, and they were basically the commodity that the record label, or Frank as the producer, saw them as, in order to use them to make lots of money for himself and the record label on the whole. So as part of this class action lawsuit for fraud, they tried to settle initially by offering a refund, and this is the record label offering a refund for Arista credits, which were credits for future Arista releases. Obviously, people didn't really go for that. They wanted their money back, not future credits. So it was eventually agreed in 1991 for all buyers of the albums and people who had bought tickets for the live shows to get a refund, and they had 7 months to claim for those. This is why it's really interesting, because back in 1990, 1991, there was a lawsuit because it wasn't their voices, and people could claim back for the money that they'd spent on what they thought were the singers, or at least the artists' voices that they were hearing, and for live performances. Let's now put this in context for the current day music industry, because we know that people lip sync live, even on tour. People will buy a ticket to go and watch a performance and it won't be live. And as I've already mentioned in this video, the performances of the whole band sometimes aren't live. It's just put on to look like that. So going back to 1990, why is it now different that people can't claim their money back thinking that something's live when it hasn't been expressed beforehand, before the show, that, by the way, what you're watching isn't live, it's just a backing track? So that's something that I find interesting, considering that going back to 1991, the settlement was for a refund, so it was found in a court of law that it wasn't fair, it was fraud. Now, relating this to auto-tune and pitch correction, these guys, when they were recording in the studio, if auto-tune had existed and they just auto-tuned their voices, would that now have been seen as fair? Even though those aren't their voices, it's gone through a computer processor and it's been produced to sound a lot better, would they have done it that way? And you can say that artists nowadays that do use auto-tune and, to a certain extent, you can say pitch correction, is that the same? Is it different? Because it's not their voice as it was recorded in the studio. It has been manipulated. So this is why, in the comments section, there are always people saying about how, it's a fraud, or it's not being honest, saying that this is somebody's voice, but not saying that actually it wasn't their voice. We've had to auto-tune it to make sure that they can hit the notes properly or accurately. So looking back at it now, to me, it doesn't seem too bad considering where we are with the music industry in the current day, because if they had the technology back then, I guarantee you they would have used it and it wouldn't have been questioned. They would have just said, well, they would have pretty denied it or avoided the question, but eventually they just would have said, oh yeah, we use auto-tune like everybody else. And the other thing that we can say, this difference in opinion between generations, because I think the older generation think that you have to be able to actually do something to get credit for it. It's the credibility, it's the artistic integrity. Whereas I think the younger generation just listen to it, and if they like it, they don't care how it's been produced. They don't care if the person they're listening to can actually do it or not. They just like the sound. I think it's the same thing that I'm not very good at painting or drawing, so I can paint a sketch that isn't very good and people will look at it and think, yeah, that's not very good. But if I load it into Photoshop, for example, put it through some software that makes it look more realistic or better artistically, and then I print it off and then say I drew this or I painted this, people would then say, oh wow, that looks really good. And I say, thank you, I did that. Whereas I know really the sketch that I did before was pretty bad, but now what I'm presenting to everybody through the software is very impressive. And that's what auto-tune and pitch correction can do. It's just putting it through a computer to make the original sound better in the end. If somebody bought my artworks, would they feel cheated that it wasn't actually me that did it, that I just drew something and then had to change it a lot? There's the whole artistic integrity thing. I know that a lot of people do believe that art should have integrity, and unfortunately when you go to the music industry as it is, just the mainstream music industry, they're not worried about integrity, they're just worried about sales, and I think that's where the problem really lies. But it would be really interesting if on albums and singles that used pitch correction and auto-tune, if it had on the front just a sticker that said auto-tune and pitch correction have been used on these lead vocals, whether that would affect sales or not. Because looking at this example back in 1991 where the lawsuit came about, you can tell that there obviously had to be thousands upon thousands of people that weren't happy at all. And you've got to imagine that the same would be true nowadays, because a lot of people that do buy music are from a different generation where they think what they're hearing is valid and, you know, artistically credible. But if they knew that it wasn't, would they then buy it? How would that affect sales? And the reason that they don't put that on the front, I think, is because it would significantly damage the reputation of the singers who have these stickers on their album. People will start to just lean towards and go to singers that they knew were singing as they can sing and as they can sing live. But this is one of those videos that probably has already gone on for years, but it could go on because it's a discussion, it's an open-ended discussion, and let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. But when we look back to 1990 here and how people felt that it was fraud, how does this correlate to the current industry? That's what I find really interesting. There's the argument as well that it wasn't their voices. Is it just that they have to use their voice to begin with, regardless of how bad it is, and then use the software to make it sound better? Is that, I mean, it sounds crazy to me, but is that what we're judging it on? So no matter how bad you are at singing, if something can then make you sound good at singing, is that now okay because at least you made the noise in the first place? I mean, it gets really complicated because then you could say, right, I can make a noise. If that noise is then made into sounding really good singing-wise by computer software, and then I go on tour and mime to the computer software version of my noise, is that now seen as okay because you made the noise? So yeah, really complicated. Like I said, very difficult, but in my eyes, for this kind of situation, take the focus away from the two guys on stage because they had very little to do with anything. They've just been manipulated like so many artists have been in the past by the record label. That's just as simple as it was. But obviously you've got to take into consideration their mental health. But like I said, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below and keep those suggestions and requests coming for future videos. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!